Welcome to Climate Channel, Climate Conversation with Chowdhury, Climate Action Pathways, episode 66. In this 66th episode, we are going to discuss with the upcoming COP27 at Sharm el-Sheikh in Egypt come November. We all know that climate is changing and it is changing fast. We are at climate emergency. As IPCC AR6 report already flagged that it is code red and we have to respond. And we have seen in last November at Glasgow, we had Glasgow Climate Pact agreed upon. Though there are a lot of frustrations that it is not ambitious enough, it is not enough to have the 1.5 degree landmark Paris Agreement global goal of keeping temperature rise at 1.5 alive. But there are also some progresses, but some of the issues, agendas were forwarded to Sharm el-Sheikh, like setting the global adaptation goal, revisiting the national determined contribution or NDCs upward before COP27 at Sharm el-Sheikh, and also fixing the definition of climate finance and also the loss and damage finance mechanism. So there are a lot of thorny issues before us, but we need to smash the hardness, the crunch issues, especially how to phase out carbon pricing, putting a price tag on carbon tax. All those issues we need to sort out quickly so that we can achieve 1.5 degree regime of our temperature, so that we can rescue more than 3 billion people who are now on the hook of adverse impacts of climatic changes across the globe. We need to take them off the hook. So adaptation goal has to be set, fixed. Adaptation finance needs to be quadruple. And climate finance has to be a robust one. We need a Marshall Plan type of action plan for the climate emergency. Without much ado, I would now like to request Suzana Carp to initiate this conversation with Chowdhury today. Suzana Carp.
Thank you very much, and good afternoon to everyone watching us, or good morning, good evening, wherever you may find yourselves around the world. I wanted to, first of all, thank you so much for inviting me to take part in this conversation. I do think it is an extremely important conversation, and you very well highlighted the urgency of it as well. Starting, of course, with the talks in November, although they were not the beginning point in our efforts to mitigate the climate emergency around the world, but let's take that as our departing point, because to many, COP26 was actually sort of bringing us closer to finalizing the rule book on the Paris Agreement governance structures. And at the same time, I think to many more of us, it's opening up a whole new debate of how we're actually going to reduce emissions to reach a carbon neutral second half of the century. So I'm here today representing Carbon Free Europe, which is an organization started at COP26 in full recognition of the urgency highlighted by the latest IPCC reports that indeed our current pathways for reducing emissions are not in line with the Paris Agreement. And Carbon Free Europe was created between a think tank based in Washington, D.C. called Third Way, and ourselves on the European continent. So for now, it's me as the new executive director, and we very much look to build partnerships across Europe and to create a transatlantic conversation that seeks to involve other partners into the tricky and difficult conversations we need to be having about technologies, net zero technologies, and how to actually steer investments towards these technologies all around the world. And I very much like that in the introduction, you mentioned the role of different financing schemes, including some which emerge from carbon pricing. So indeed, we've seen that the European Union has proposed a carbon border adjustment mechanism. And as it stands, the European Parliament is still due to fully endorse it. But the part that we still have to decide, and I hope we very much get to do so with other partners around the world, is how the revenues from this scheme will be used to support clean development and clean technologies being deployed around the world. So that's a little bit where we hope to land at COP27. And also in the European Union, we would like to move the conversation a bit away from the one around governance and how exactly we plan to necessarily meet our goals, because that conversation has been had for 5 years now. And we now would like to talk about indeed the investment flows that need to occur, the technologies available, and how all the continents can actually benefit from what we can bring forward, which is a transatlantic conversation on these options that we currently have.
Thank you, Susan, for your introductory remarks, and congratulations on your appointment as executive director. Hopefully, you can help reshape Europe in terms of carbon phasing out or phasing down. Without much ado, I would now like to ask Ciaran, what is your take? How do you foresee?
I think we're seeing significant movement within the European Union with the Fit for 55 package, and that will see significant legislation moving on in the course of 2022 in advance of the COP in November. I think, as Suzana and you have pointed out, a crucial issue is how the developed world will reach out to developing countries in terms of both technical assistance and finance. And I think my takeaway from the last COP was that there is an infatuation with technological fixes and a view that big companies will sort this out, and there isn't enough attention paid on the quieter voices, on the smaller countries, and on what they need in terms of making a transition. My hope is that by having a COP within the African continent, it will draw attention to the fact that Africa's emissions are only 3 or 4% of the global total. And I would like to think that this will open up a discussion about greener or softer development paths in those countries, and less discussion of the problems that we have in Europe or in North America. And I would hope that with the new administration in the US and with the progress in Europe, there would be a listening voice to the concerns of Africa, of countries in Africa and small nations around the world who will be more impacted by climate change.
Thank you very much for setting that tone, especially your optimism after return of United States to the Paris Agreement. So implementation of Paris Agreement, we see light at the end of the tunnel. And also, you are absolutely right. We do need to have some concrete, not only adaptation actions, but also mitigation measures and technology transfer to Africa and continent, which is affected by drought, flooding, inundation, so on, so forth, and also smaller countries, the least developed countries, vulnerable countries of Latin America and Caribbean, Asia Pacific, and other parts of the world. So it's a huge task. Hopefully this year we can unfold a lot of agenda items, and we can crack the hard nuts this time. Laurent, how do you look at?
Thank you very much.
What is your reflection?
Well, first of all, thank you for inviting us and having this discussion, which is very useful. And I agree with Suzana and Ciaran about their ideas. Maybe I would build upon it and elaborate on what Ciaran has just mentioned with regards to, attracting some more attention towards Africa. And I would say Africa and the Arab region. Because I was mentioning this with colleagues from the IPCC the other day, and I highlighted the fact that, we have big continents, but what is at the crossroads of some of them is not necessarily well addressed, be it in the IPCC reports and or in then the work of all what goes under the UNFCCC. So for instance, I was a board member of one body under the UNFCCC, the CTCN, so the Climate Technology Center and Network, exactly, which is part of the tech mechanism and the technology mechanism. And at the end of the day, when we had our reports annually at the board, we saw these big groups, so Africa, Asia, etc. And Asia is such a big group that you could not see, all the discrepancies between the different climate actions undertaken. And some countries were extremely active, and some others were not. And this is a key point I would like to emphasize. We have, especially for the LDCs, Quamrul, you referred to them, obviously, for obvious reasons. And we do have a problem because very often they do not get access to their share of climate finance or climate assistance when it is about technology transfer. And we do definitely have to act upon this much more. So when I was a board member, I put the emphasis on capacity building, on creating incubators for requests, national requests coming from LDCs. But then we reach within these bodies, even during the advisory boards, within these bodies under the UNFCCC, then we reach a sort of glass ceiling, and then we are told, but this is not the mandate we've received from the COP. And so that's why we need to prepare well ahead of time for this conference in Sharm el-Sheikh. We need to prepare well so that then there is this mandate that also happens and that then we can go further. And I should say that I think all of us were not naive, and we know that, during these conversations, there is the problem of big money, which happens now and then. And for instance, helping with regards to research and development of technologies, indigenous, technologies, is sometimes something Western countries try to avoid, really, because they see there might be a threat in the future. And so we do need, civil society, researchers, etc., Ringos, even bingos. We need to talk to move forward the agenda towards having more research and development and more technology transfer, including towards the LDCs, and creating this enhancing environment, this enabling environment where we can really have this cooperation. Otherwise, we will never be on track, not even for 1.5, but also for 2 degrees Celsius. We will never get back on track. Because yes, Africa is still a small part of emissions, like the rest of the global south, but it's increasing. So this is important that we have this technology transfer, because it enables not just to have some mitigation, by the way, which can be ecosystem-based adaptation that enables also some mitigation, but it also enables to reach the SDGs, which we need to have, you know, this convergence happening. So I'm very optimistic that we have this conversation and we need to create a momentum, especially with regards to LDCs and how we can have these LDCs and their representatives being able to make all these so-called bankable requests. Again, I've made not long ago a review of what goes to different climate finance vehicles, and the LDCs are really underrepresented, although they are a priority, and even on the paper coming out of the COPs, especially black, you know, landlocked countries are, you know, nominated. They are, the paper is there, but the reality doesn't happen because of this lack of capacity building. So this is really something I look forward to developing. Yes.
Thank you for flagging right issues, especially in terms of least developed countries, climate finance, in terms of their low capacities, low skills, even at times low level of expertise, and preparing, say, programs or project proposals. So there are a lot of that, and also accessibility is a huge issue. Fernandez.
Yes, so it's all very interesting, but I think I don't have the same personal feeling about urgency, actually, because according to current emission trends, what I understand is that by 2030, 1.5 is buried. By 2036, 1.7 is buried. And by 2044, 2 degrees is buried. By buried, I mean less than 50% chances. Huh? And according to what I know, it would mean if we still want to achieve 2 degrees, 66% chances, we would need to be 5% CO2 decrease per year from now. And I don't see that happening at all, to tell the truth. And I don't know from the policies of all countries over the world, but Switzerland, where I live, is emblematic of what a developed country can be. And I don't see any of our policies allowing remotely a decrease in that. And even they assume what I would consider wishful thinking, like the ability to replace from 2045 to 2050 all kerosene supply for our airplanes with power to kerosene in 5 years with electricity that would come from I don't know where at the moment. So I'm afraid that in all the discussions we have, there's the thing we hide or we don't talk about is that it's impossible to achieve unless we reduce in developed countries our consumption fundamentally. And I'm always impressed that that's never addressed in public forums. I don't know what your take on.
Yeah. Thank you, Fernandez. Suzana, at your initial, say, intervention, you try to flag the carbon pricing, carbon phase out or phase down. But how to do it quite fast? How to ensure the robustness of, say, the system, the rule book, the mechanism itself? Because if the mechanism is not right one, then it might get into, say, more emission, not a reduction of emission. So how to ensure the integrity of the system, transparency, accountability, and also, say, avoiding double counting, avoiding, say, the integrity and also ensuring the integrity of the system.
Thank you for those questions. And I think they actually link very nicely to what the previous speaker also mentioned, the issue around consumption and the wider view on a carbon footprint, and talking also about sort of whole life cycle approaches to the movements of carbon around the world. And part of the reason why in my initial intervention I brought up the carbon border adjustment mechanism is because such a policy, and it is not the only one, but it represents a tool that seeks to encourage convergence. In terms of alignment on standards or alignment on how exactly we talk about trade, which at the moment is still highly unsustainable, very carbon emitting, even if it's trade that takes place around green technologies or sort of as it's emerging a market around green hydrogen, but the questions about how that's being transported around the world remain. So, or arise actually at this point in time, really. So I think in terms of ensuring the guidebook sort of holds the global partners together, I think we need to look towards options that allow us to converge towards the same systems of accounting for carbon, the same way of dealing with sort of end-of-life products. So the way we deal with plastics and, you know, kind of talking about the need to actually capture CO2 when we're incinerating plastics, wherever that is around the world, we should seek to find ways that our policies around that converge. And I also share your concern that unless these mechanisms are properly established, we could actually be increasing emissions, and so decreasing them in one part of the world, but increasing them elsewhere. And that certainly wouldn't help our global predicament. So I am a big advocate for policies that seek to encourage that pathways, even if differentiated as they ought to be, but that they are designed and encouraged to be converging around the same principles, around the same standards. And we are really talking about the emergence of an economy based around carbon accounting, something we haven't done so far, obviously having not really accounted for carbon over the past 7 centuries. So we're at that point in time where the accounting conversation becomes critical, and at the same time, we can't really wait for it to be fully finalized until we move ahead with the technologies that we know are net zero compatible. So some of the conversation will have to move ahead when it comes to deployment. And it's very interesting because the EU already created a program last year, which I think has gone under the radar and inside the EU as well, but it's a global gateway strategy seeking to mobilize 300 billion euros to go into investments around the world that do encourage clean energy and also policies that meet the SDGs. And I haven't heard much talk about this inside the EU. I'm not sure this is talked about very much outside the EU. So there are streams of financing which we're not paying sufficient attention to. There is an urgent conversation around carbon accounting that needs to happen, and the carbon border adjustment mechanism is forcing the world into this conversation, but we shouldn't be scared of the conversation. And at the same time, because there is indeed an urgency so that we don't bury those goals, we very much fought hard to have a global consensus around, so that we also need to then move ahead on the technological front. So how we bring these three separate aspects together to happen in a synergic way rather than in sort of diverging discussions, I think that is the big task for COP27, and I very much hope that we can live up to the task. And in terms of the carbon consumption of let's say the EU, but also the EU and the US put together, maybe, I mean, that would be an interesting angle to approach COP27 from as well, because it's one that we haven't talked about very much. And you will have voices in the EU that also say, oh, our continent is only responsible for 9% of the global emissions. But in reality, when you look at the global consumption of Europe, we're responsible for much more. And of course, taking into account the history of climate change and how it developed, the responsibility for the EU is huge. And that's why I think the EU Green Deal has to be a Green Deal for the rest of the world as well, not just for Europeans.
Yeah, you are absolutely right. Not only EU, USA, but also, say, environmental integrity group led by Switzerland and also Nordic countries together is a huge, huge potential to unlock, say, net zero or net negative. Sharon, your take, especially on legislative fronts, legislation, because whatever
I
mechanism.
think legislation, certainly from an EU perspective, legislation is happening, but it does take 1 or 2 years for these very important files to pass through the European Parliament and reach agreement in trialogue with the Council and with the Commission. So I think, yes, Suzana's right, we do need to move in advance of the legislation being approved, and we cannot simply wait. I mean, as we have heard, the numbers are very stark. The chance of maintaining a temperature under 2 degrees is going to be very difficult to achieve. To have any chance of doing that, we need to be moving ahead now. So actually it comes down to both countries, national governments, and to regional and local governments. We can't simply wait for the binding global deal or the binding EU legislation. And I would always argue that climate action, it has to happen at every level, from the personal to the global. And we cannot wait for all the different pieces to be absolutely smoothly aligned before we take action. So I think there is an important role for regions, for member states, and for countries and cities. For instance, the European Union has a mission for 100 climate neutral cities. I'm hoping that my own home city of Dublin will join, and that's a way of disseminating information and sharing knowledge so that cities can put themselves on a lower carbon trajectory. So let's not wait for the final legislation or the COP that finally sorts everything out. We need to move now, and we need to move with the urgency that the issue deserves.
Thank you very much to flag this issue. Killian, what is your reflection? What is your thought?
Yes, hello. Thanks for having me. And well, I'd say I'd be the one maybe representing more the youth in this conversation. But I wanted to mention what Suzana mentioned as well, which is with ESGs, the importance of rating. They can be really very different in the industry. If you look at American ratings compared to European ones, and this can really influence the way ESGs are carried out in the industry. And if we're looking at acting globally as well as locally, we need to make sure that government and industry act together. And I think ESG is a way through this. Where I'm involved in COP27 is at the moment, I'm doing workshops and working at training youth delegates at negotiation, lobbying, and influencing. This, so that when they're actually at COP26, well, when they're at COP27, they're able to really influence decision makers, because that's something that youth, when I was talking to delegates, for them, it was very hard to be able to speak up at COP26. They weren't involved in the discussion as much. So I believe that diversity as well, I think that should be something very important to discuss, and something that has to be taken into account for COP27, which voices are heard, because at the moment the youth are disproportionately going to be affected by this. So very much teaching them the skills to be able to negotiate with leaders at COP27, and also I think talking about individuals and decision makers as well as the organizations, I think we should start shifting the way we're educating about climate change. So it should be something where we get, well, I've been involved as well in doing curriculums and doing programs in school. I was in Stowe School, and I did a program in which Greenpeace, we organized leaders to come in and speak about climate change. And I think we should have a lot more of this. It shouldn't just be decision makers. So I'm doing this as part of Climate Interactive, which is a startup from MIT, think tank from MIT, where we talk with decision makers. And I really think that this should be a way that we have to continue educating people about the climate emergency as well, in industry as well as governmental and individuals. So yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, Fernandez.
I have a few issues actually. Is that my impression as a citizen, looking at how my country behaves in the COP, is that nothing will ever be achieved at the COP that the countries internally didn't agree before. And currently my government typically is absolutely not pushing for ambitious targets like reducing 5% per year. So they'll never negotiate and support that. They're happy to negotiate and help African countries not to increase their CO2, but they will never agree on decreasing theirs significantly. The second thing that amazes me, because I'm a project manager by profession, is that we're discussing how, without setting the targets in time. And personally, when I start a project, I want to know by when it is to be delivered and what are my constraints. And today, as a father, I would say, constraints are, we need to stay under 1.5, which means that we should be decreasing 15% per year now. And you have 10 years to deploy that project. Once you have the targets, our governments can figure out the solutions, which actually look like a Marshall Plan or even a prepare to war effort, clearly. But outside of those hard constraints, I'm quite pessimistic on the capacity of any COP to achieve anything significant, except saying, okay, we're going to give some money to eventually allow some people in Bangladesh to raise their houses a bit more. But beyond that, I don't see anything significant. And I really feel
with all your takes, we are closing this episode and hopefully see you in any of our next episode. And hopefully at Sharm el-Sheikh, we can smash the hardness and take concrete actions, meaningful actions, effective actions to effectively, fully implement Paris Agreement and go beyond net zero, net negative. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Quamrul. Thank you very much.
Bye. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
So see you again. See you, Killian.
Thank you. Bye.